reasonable precaution. So long as your commute is reasonable, I think this is a reasonable position in a vacuum, which you can get on sale for a very reasonable price. I needed to find a way to hold these components in with reasonable security. And how to do both those things with a more reasonable amount of input power. If it were meant to be able to produce a reasonable color image on its own, it was the only reasonable way to handle so much data so quickly. A much more reasonable heating element in the neighborhood of 900 watts is used. It took a while for consumer devices to get to reasonable prices. Clearly, the SAE has a much more reasonable understanding of what the stop lamps are for. A much easier to swallow price that made the payback period reasonable, but let's be reasonable. Honestly, that seemed very reasonable to me. Some engineers deemed 1,000 hours a reasonable figure to balance the various operational aspects of an incandescent bulb, so long as the costs are reasonable, allowing you to control the temperature within a reasonable degree, and sell them for a reasonable price. There's no getting around the fact that the tape has to travel past the heads at least a dozen feet per second or so to get a reasonable picture. Their cost has reached reasonable levels. Substations will step that down to a more reasonable 11 or maybe 32,000 volts for neighborhood distribution. They were put on the market for a reasonable 198,000 yen. So now that I had a reasonable method of coloring the wax, but best of all, a Dolby B encoded tape could be played back on a standard cassette deck with reasonable results. But I think a reasonable explanation is simply the flame ends up stuck inside the deflectors.